For the most part, modern historians have all but given up believing there is any truth to the stories mentioned in the Bible regarding Moses and the Hebrew Exodus. The tales are simply too fanciful and supernatural to be taken seriously. Tales describing 10 horrendous plagues, parting of the Red Sea, and 40 years of wandering have been relegated to the fiction section as far as most historians are concerned. Couple that with the fact that no mention of Joseph, Moses, or the Exodus are found in any surviving Egyptian hieroglyphics have led to a general consensus that these are simply mythical fables meant for entertainment. Or are they? New evidence has recently been brought to light that is causing experts to rethink this age-old controversy. Is it possible there is more truth to these biblical stories than previously thought? New evidence is causing many to reconsider. A new biblical timeline combined with actual evidence in the Egyptian records has reopened the debate. Pacific Street Productions presents 1174 BC, the Exodus Discovered. Putting the puzzle pieces together for this new timeline starts by looking at the actual text of the Bible and piecing together the origins of Hebrew civilization. According to the Bible, it all starts with Abraham, who is said to have received a vision at the age 60 that he will father a very special line of people. After getting this message, he moves from the land of Ur, which is modern-day Iraq, to the land of Canaan, which is the territory that makes up modern-day Israel. This year marks the starting point of Hebrew civilization. Using the text of the Bible, we can trace the lineage of Abraham numerous generations down to King David, King Solomon, and eventually to Jesus of Nazareth. The key part of this timeline is to focus on the period between Jacob, who changes his name to Israel, and King David, 12 generations in total, which includes their captivity in Egypt and the Exodus. In fact, there are 4 important dates in ancient Hebrew history that are quite significant: the year Abraham moved to Canaan, the year Jacob moved to Egypt, the Exodus, and the building of Solomon's Temple, which we know started in 966 BC. Now, if we overlay the Hebrew genealogy and match up the names with their commonly accepted birth dates, we find some basic problems with the math that cannot be explained. Biblical scholars have been aware of these gaps for hundreds of years, but for the most part these anomalies have been ignored. For example, the currently held belief is there were 910 years between Jacob and Solomon. However, looking closely at the lineage, there are not enough generations listed to fill such a long span of time. We would need an average generation gap of nearly 100 years to fill that span of time. That means fathers having their sons at the age of 100, and this in a time period where many were living to only 70. It is simply not possible, and the facts do not line up. So it's clear this timeline, which you will find printed in nearly any study Bible, is not accurate. The questions are, can we identify the mistakes that led to this 910 years? And can we know what the real timeline is? The answer to both questions is yes. You can walk into any library or bookstore, go to the religion section, and open a study Bible or biblical reference book. You are likely to see the Exodus dated 1446 BC, Jacob moving to Egypt in 1876 BC, and Abraham's move to Canaan in 2091 BC. Biblical scholars have accepted these dates for hundreds of years, but are they accurate? If we focus on the time between the Exodus and Solomon's Temple, it turns out the dating is based on a single verse in the Bible.
In the 480th year after the Israelites came out of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, the 2nd month, he began to build the temple of the Lord.
Historians have placed Solomon's Temple in the year 966 BC, so counting 480 years gives us 1446 BC. That is how the Exodus is currently dated. But if we look at our timeline, we know Salmon, son of Nahshon, was born about the same time as the Exodus. Historians also know King David was born in 1040 BC. Knowing the Exodus was exactly 4 generations before King David leaves us a full 406-year span with only 4 generations to fill. This in a time when people were living only 70 years on average. The math is simply not possible. 1446 BC was not the year of the Exodus. The average generation gap in that period of time was around 40 years, which means the Exodus actually happened around 1200 BC. But what about that verse? 1 Kings 6:1 never specifically mentions the Exodus, and likely instead refers to a 12-generation span starting with the year the Israelites came out to Egypt, not out of Egypt. Now, focusing on the number of years the Israelites were in Egypt, we find the following verse.
And the length of time the Israelite people lived in Egypt was 430 years. At the end of the 430 years to the very day, all the Lord's divisions left Egypt.
This verse seems clearly written, but again we have a math problem. We can see there are not enough generations that lived in Egypt to fill 430 years. The gap is even more pronounced when we look at the line of Levi, who was a brother of Judah. Focusing on Levi, we are told Kohath was born before Jacob moved to Egypt, and Moses was 80 years old at the time of the Exodus. That leaves only one generation between them, which certainly cannot span 430 years. So 430 years is not possible for the time the Israelites lived in Egypt. But if you study that verse, you will discover something amazing. It turns out there is a little footnote next to the word Egypt that seemingly no Bible scholar has ever paid any attention to. The footnote says Egypt and Canaan. This means, correctly translated, the 430 years starts with the year Abraham moved to Canaan, and the Israelites actually lived in Egypt only 215 years. We find confirmation of this translation when we turn to Josephus, a first-century historian who wrote about these very events.
They left Egypt in the month of Xanthicus, on the 15th day of the lunar month, 430 years after our forefather Abraham came into Canaan, but 215 years only after Jacob removed into Egypt.
We find further confirmation in the New Testament by Paul.
The promises were spoken to Abraham and to his seed. The law, introduced 430 years later, does not set aside the covenant previously established by God.
This confirms that Moses and the law came 430 years after Abraham moved to Canaan. We have solid proof that educated historians who lived 2,000 years ago understood the correct timeline, and it was not until hundreds of years later that people began mistranslating the verses, leading to bizarre timelines that do not make sense and do not add up. We further know that the true date of the Exodus is near 1200 BC, 246 years later than the traditional date. The next step is to compare this new Hebrew timeline to the historical record of Egypt. Hold on to your seats. The four key moments in Hebrew history are Abram moving to Canaan, Jacob moving to Egypt, the Exodus, and the building of Solomon's temple. Using math and science, we have mapped the Exodus near the year 1200 BC and Jacob's journey in 1389 BC. According to the Bible, Jacob came to Egypt at a time that famine was ravaging the region and only Egypt was thriving. This reportedly was because his son Joseph had been placed in charge of Egypt and had stored up a great quantity of grain in the years leading up to the famine.
When the famine had spread over the whole country, Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold grain to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe throughout Egypt, and all the world came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph because the famine was severe everywhere.
Turning to the history books, we find that Amenhotep II rules Egypt from 1390 to 1352 BC and is described as one of the most prosperous and stable in Egyptian history.
Amenhotep had a large and ever-increasing number of ladies in his harem. Several of them were foreign princesses, the result of diplomatic marriages.
We find a situation in Egypt that very conveniently matches up with the story of Joseph, including a period in Egyptian history in which the empire was growing but without a single military conquest mentioned. This is a fact that has puzzled many historians.
The wealth of Egypt at this period came not from the spoils of conquest, as it had under Thutmose, but from international trade and an abundant supply of gold.
Pushing forward in Egyptian history, what happened after Amenhotep died? This would be a time period when Joseph was still living and presumably active in Egyptian governance. Are there any clues of his influence? The answers might surprise you. The next 30 years is what's known as the Amarna period in Egyptian history, an extraordinary time, when the Egyptians rejected their prior religion and previous gods and converted to a new religion with a single, monotheistic god named Aten. This period starts with Akhenaten, continues through King Tut, and ends with the death of the pharaoh Ai in the year 1320 BC, which coincidentally is the same year Joseph would have died according to our timeline. Akhenaten ushers in a new period by abandoning traditional Egyptian polytheism and introducing worship centered on Aten, a monotheistic god. Is it possible Joseph is the true force behind this conversion? Consider this: the name of the Egyptian deity Aten transliterates into the Hebrew word Aden. Aden is translated by English Bibles as the Lord, and Adonai translated as my Lord, which is in the Bible as an exclusive personal name of God. So what happens next in Egypt following the Amarna period? The answers are rather shocking. Following the death of Joseph and the pharaoh Ai in 1320 BC, we see the Egyptians revert back to polytheism and begin the greatest period of Egyptian construction projects ever. Could this be the result of the Hebrew slaves living in Egypt? Starting with the pharaoh Horemheb, we see great contempt for the Amarna pharaohs and their god Aten, coupled with a period of construction never seen before or since. This all culminates with the greatest pharaoh of all, Ramses the Great.
During his long reign of 67 years, everything was done on a grand scale. No other pharaoh constructed as many temples or erected anywhere near the number of colossal statues and obelisks.
There is also a great deal of evidence in the Bible itself pointing to Ramses as being the pharaoh of the Exodus. The name Ramses appears 6 times in 3 different books of the Bible, all of them ascribed to the writings of Moses in the years immediately following the Exodus. How can it be that the name Ramses is so common in the Bible and so familiar to Moses if the Exodus happened in 1446 BC, 167 years before Ramses' reign? Historians have never addressed this contradiction. The obvious answer is that the Exodus happened after Ramses came to power, providing added evidence that the traditional dates are wrong by several hundred years. Now, let's see if we can find Joseph in the Egyptian history. If we focus on the Amarna period of Egyptian history, we find a mysterious conversion to a monotheistic religion under the pharaohs Akhenaten, Tut, and Ai. Are we able to find evidence of Joseph in this period? Akhenaten and Tut were both of royal Egyptian descent with clear lineages. But who was this mysterious pharaoh Ai who ruled for 4 years and died in the same year as Joseph? The truth is, modern historians and Egyptian scholars know very little about this pharaoh. No one is certain who this man was, where he came from, who his parents were, or how he rose to power in the first place. His entire reign is shrouded in mystery.
The grounds on which Ai based his successful claim to power are not entirely clear.
Who was Ai? Where was he born? At what age did he come to power? No one knows. Could this actually be the biblical figure Joseph? There are several pieces of evidence supporting this theory. To begin with, we know that Ai was a commoner, not born of royal Egyptian blood. His inscription found in the Egyptian hieroglyphics is translated the Father of God, implying he was the driving force behind the conversion to Aten. We also know he was the chief minister of Akhenaten, adding further evidence that he could have been the initiator of the conversion. Additionally, his tomb was desecrated following his death, indicating the Egyptians considered him to be an outsider. There are also clues in the Bible supporting this theory.
So Joseph died at the age of 110. And after they embalmed him, he was placed in a coffin in Egypt.
The Bible explicitly tells us that Joseph was embalmed as a mummy and placed in a tomb in Egypt. Embalming and tomb burial were not used on common citizens in Egypt. And finally, there's this verse.
Moses took the bones of Joseph with him because Joseph had made the Israelites swear an oath.
The Bible tells us the bones of Joseph were removed from Egypt. This is very curious because the remains of Ai have never been found. In fact, he is the only pharaoh of this era that does not today have a mummy in some museum. Is it possible the pharaoh Ai was in fact Joseph? The evidence points to yes. The final step in our theory is to pinpoint the exact date of the Exodus. Looking at our timeline, we now have all important dates figured out except the exact year of the Exodus. To review how we arrived at these dates, we can overlay the genealogies mentioned in the Bible. Historians date David's birth in 1040 BC, and we see there are exactly 10 generations between David and Judah. Counting 40 years per generation, we get 400 years, or 1440 BC, for the birth of Judah. This date is calculated, but it matches up perfectly with the events in Egypt, including Joseph being the pharaoh Ai. It further shows Ramses the Great leading Egypt at the time of the Hebrew slaves in Egypt. Now things get interesting. Remember, the Bible and Josephus date the Exodus exactly 430 years after Abraham's journey to Canaan. But when we count out 430 years, it gives us the date 1174 BC, which is past the death of Ramses. But it does give us what is either an amazing coincidence or the smoking gun confirming the accuracy of this new timeline. The date 1174 BC is exactly 215 years from the completion of Solomon's temple, giving us perfect alignment of all four historical events. No historian has ever suggested this date, but the evidence is quite compelling. So why does the Bible mention Ramses if he was not the pharaoh of the Exodus? Who was ruling in 1174 BC, and what was happening in Egypt? The answers to these questions will shock you. Following the death of Ramses II in 1191 BC, we see 6 lesser-known pharaohs that follow. Then, in 1186, we find a pharaoh rise to power who will rule Egypt as, quote, the last great pharaoh of Egypt. His name? Ramses. Ramses III, to be exact. This is a shocking development because no historian has ever attempted to place the Exodus this far forward in time, but the evidence is overwhelming. What's even more intriguing is that there is a 20-year gap in Egyptian history starting in 1174 BC that can only be called a black hole. No one is quite sure what happened in those 20 years, but Egypt prior to that was the dominant empire on the earth. Following this black hole, Egypt crumbles into chaos, and no one seems to know why. Ramses fights 3 wars in his early years and soundly wins all 3. The fighting power and dominance of the Egyptian army is undisputed. Then we enter the black hole. There are no battles or building projects mentioned in the history of Egypt following 1174 BC. Then some 20 years later, in 1156 BC, we see Ramses embroiled in a grand plot to overthrow him. The empire crumbles into chaos and he dies a year later. The empire dissolves within months. So what happened in those 20 years to cause the empire to suddenly cease? No one knows. The only thing we can be certain was the event was large enough to destroy the entire Egyptian army and embarrass the Egyptians into silence. It is an event so massive it would have to rival the Hebrew Exodus. Get Rick Mercer's book, 1174 BC, The Exodus Discovered, to read all the shocking details of this extraordinary theory.